Originally released on the NEC PC-98 in 1994, with subsequent releases on the Panasonic 3DO, Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn respectively in 1995 and 1996 in Japan only, Policenauts is an interactive adventure visual novel with point-and-click elements developed and published by Konami. The game is also known as one of Metal Gear creator Hideo Kojima's works, and as such references previous games he's worked on as well as pays homage to movies, given Kojima's love of films. While the game was planned for an English localization on the Sega Saturn, it never came to pass, and on August 24, 2009, to celebrate Kojima's 46th birthday, a fan translation of the PlayStation version got released, which is what I'll be covering. In this game you play as Private Investigator Jonathan Ingram. Jonathan was one of 5 policemen, known as the original cops, tasked with caring for Beyond Coast, a fully functional space colony in 2013. Unfortunately, he has an accident while working in space and is presumed dead. However, he is found 25 years later alive and well thanks to the module connected to his suit, which had put him into cold sleep, and as a result he's maintained his youthful physical appearance despite technically being in his 50s. This pays homage to the Japanese legend of Urashima Taro, a man who saves a turtle and after spending 3 days in their underwater kingdom, returns to land to find that 300 years have passed. The game takes place 3 years after Jonathan is found, and our adventure begins when he is visited by his ex-wife Lorraine, who asks for Jonathan's help in finding her current husband Kenzo Hojo, who had disappeared. After telling Lorraine that he needs to think about it and sends her on her way, she is attacked and murdered right outside of Jonathan's office when the car she was about to get into explodes. Jonathan chases the assailant to an alley, who unfortunately manages to escape, and as a result Jonathan decides to accept the case and travel to Beyond to investigate Lorraine's murder and her husband's disappearance, hoping to enlist the help of his old friend and partner Ed Brown. But is the game any good? Let's find out in The Good. I personally think the story in Policenauts is the greatest part of it. With a lot of visual novels or point-and-click adventures, story is perhaps one of the most important parts, as without that, there's very little reason and motivation to play one, and I felt that Policenauts nailed the story very well. The game also addresses some of the more technical aspects of space, such as space travel and the long-term effects of radiation on the human body, as well as life on Beyond and how things function in there, which quite a lot of stories don't tend to cover. This shows that a lot of planning and thought was put into the setting of the game, and while you don't have to worry a huge deal about most of these little tidbits of information, it's pretty neat to have an explanation for them. For the most part, I really liked the game mechanics. Throughout the game, there are sections which play out as an on-rail shooter, which really breaks up the monotony of reading through the game. These segments can be played using a PlayStation controller, but for a majority of them I opted to use the PlayStation mouse, and believe me, it's a godsend for most of these segments. The on-rail segments can range from a shootout between one or multiple enemies, or target practice at the police station's gun range. To keep things fresh, as well as the shooting segments, there are other interactive moments, such as matching up bags or trying to catch a robotic mosquito. The mechanics I felt made the game a more enjoyable experience, as the level of interactivity combined with an engaging story keeps you involved. Character development was handled very well for a majority of the characters. A good example of this was Jonathan's fear of travelling into space. As a result of his accident, he's had a very deep-seated fear about space travel, and in the second chapter it's clear that he's only travelling to solve the case for his ex-wife, and that he's very uncomfortable with the trip. Later on in the game, he's very reluctant to return to Beyond from the moon, and it's up to his partner Ed to more or less force him back. I like the fact that Jonathan is still very nervous about travelling into space throughout the course of the game, and it's not a fear that he easily gets over. Another good example of character development also includes Ed, whose fear of firing his gun gets established and overcome throughout the game. It adds a very relatable element to the characters and shows that they have their own issues and traumas to deal with as well, just like how we're about to deal with The Bad. Some of the puzzles I found in Policenauts can be a little intimidating for some players. Some examples include a section in which Jonathan and Ed are trying to defuse a bomb. The process is divided up into several sections, and like bomb defusing, mistakes are fatal. To add to things, a piece of information provided earlier in the game serves as the answer to the last step, and if you happen to answer incorrectly, you're back at the start of the bomb defusing section again. Oh, I almost forgot that you're timed in this process, and by the time you get to that last section, the timer is dropping at a rate so fast that you need to make a snap decision. Hope you can read at a decent pace, as that timer won't stop for you to catch up. Another puzzle I struggled with required basic knowledge of identifying Japanese family crests in order to access some information. And while a list of crests are shown elsewhere in the game, the ones you will need to identify will always be picked at random. Thankfully you can check online for the instruction booklet, which does show you all of the crests. Some of the shooting segments I found annoyed me to no end. Notable ones include trying to shoot an assailant who was escaping from you on a motorcycle during a lengthy chase scene. There was no real indication to show whether my shots were having any effect on the assailant, and after having no luck I actually ended up switching back to the PlayStation controller and finding it much easier. Another scene that I had a lot of grief on was finding a couple of suits on the moon. After a particular chain of events happen, you're required to shoot a couple of heavy suits who are attacking you. Both suits deal pretty hefty damage and require you to shoot them in the face a number of times before they die. However, I felt that it was just pure luck that I was able to beat them, as I was easily destroyed while trying to kill the second suit. Not to mention the targets you're required to hit are pretty small, making it even more frustrating than it already was. While I did praise some of the character development in the game, that doesn't necessarily apply to all of the cast. A couple of characters I felt had their development seem a little rushed, namely Karen Hojo and Tony Redwood. Without giving too much away, Karen is initially hostile to Jonathan upon their first encounter, and ultimately starts warming up to him over the course of the game. It does reach its peak later on, but I felt the build up to it went a little too quickly. Tony on the other hand initially appears as a fellow passenger on the shuttle that Jonathan is on during his trip to Beyond, and while he seems friendly enough and a little unsettling, once you meet him at the police station he's revealed to be, well, an outright dickhead to put it politely. This of course throws his intentions into question, and after simply putting two and two together, you can easily see what his role is in the grand scheme of things altogether. I think keeping some of Tony's intentions more ambiguous, and not blatantly painting him in a negative light too early in the game, would have helped with his development. I also felt that his motives did seem a little weak in comparison to other characters. Admittedly though, I do feel that the development of both of these characters are only a minor thing, and from a certain standpoint you can see what sort of feelings the game was trying to invoke from the player by having these characters depicted that way. Nonetheless, let's continue along and move on to The Ugly, where I discuss graphics, visual presentation and the game's score. The visuals of the game are very impressive. While the colony design and interior look like something straight out of Gundam, locations visited in the game had very good attention to detail and looked great. They even animate Jonathan and Ed as they travel between locations, which I thought was a nice touch. In true Kojima style, attention to detail is also evident on the characters, notably the women, even to the point where Jonathan can grope them. As I mentioned earlier, the game does play homage to movies, even going so far as having Jonathan and Ed's designs inspired by Mel Gibson and Danny Glover's appearance as Detective Martin Riggs and Roger Murtaugh from the Lethal Weapon series. The game also features a summary of the story if you are reloading your save, which was a feature that Kojima would go on to use in Metal Gear Solid. The game also features a few FMV cutscenes which were animated very well. The soundtrack is an absolute treat to listen to, and for a long time afterwards I had End of the Dark stuck in my head. If you think the song sounds familiar, it is, as it can be heard when the Konami logo appears for Metal Gear Solid. Other pieces in the soundtrack really fit the situation they're played in, and really builds things up, whether it's a more light-hearted scene, an action scene, or a suspenseful investigation section. Well worth a listen to whether you've played through the game or not, so let's wrap things up with a final thought. Overall, I was very impressed with Policenauts. The story was very engaging, with twists and turns in place, enriched with a good cast of characters and an enjoyable musical score which kept me wanting more. The fact the game goes out of its way to explain the more technical aspects such as life in space and the dangers of radiation on the human body, as well as what food is consumed on Beyond, shows a lot of thought was put into it, and I would not have expected any less from Kojima in that regard. If you're wanting a good story to read with some gameplay elements thrown in, then definitely get your hands on Policenauts and play it. You'll be in for quite a ride. With that, it's time for my rating. I would give Policenauts an astronaut out of 10. You could say the game was out of this world. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next Infinite Backlog review.